All right, let me open. And you're all set on your end? Doug, you got it recording and everything?
Yep, it's recording now. So I guess I'll get.
How do we want to open, Doug?
So Becca, we're finally doing it.
We are doing it, Doug. This is it. It has a name. It has a graphic, right? It started out not at this really cool, really techie thing. It was an idea for a book, right?
Yeah.
So that was definitely your idea. Doug definitely came to me with an idea to write a book, to compile somehow in an encyclopedic format all of the amazing special interests that autistics have, right? And how we use them, what they're good for in our lives, all of that stuff. And I, of course, was like, yes, genius, let's do that. And then I remembered COVID had hit, and I remembered how much we're using technology. And I remembered that Doug also does this stuff like I do by recording and doing audio. And I said, well, hey, what if we do some kind of technological encyclopedia, like a podcast encyclopedia, and we cover the video as well, and then I can use my YouTube and you can put it out as a podcast, and whoever's with us gets double the exposure, and we'll do all that. And then at the end, if somebody wants to take the time or money to transcribe it, they can have the encyclopedia of special interests. But I think we're excited that it turned into this thing. It was an opportunity to work with you again, which I really love.
And it's always so much fun. You know, you've been on the Autism Stories podcast so many different times now, and just love talking with you every time. And this has just kind of been festering in my mind for kind of years now, where talking with so many autistic people and just hearing them talk about their special interests and how it's been helpful to them. I'm like, well, wait a second. Everybody needs to know this. Like, everybody needs to focus on their special interests. And so,
right?
You know,
why? Right? I mean, it gives us a window into the way the autistic mind works, right? The way that it functions in terms of, yay! Nice. So in terms of how the kind of autistic mind functions and what it enjoys. And I like how when you posted about the podcast, you were like, I really like hearing about it because people's positive energy, right? And then I catch it and it's catching. And I talk about stuff like that all the time, about creating joy and sharing joy. And special interests are like the best thing that happens to the autistic brain. It's like poof, and your brain explodes and all the good things about your autism just get bigger, right? And so we can't help but be flappy happy when we're talking about our special interests, and that is contagious, right? And all of these years, people have been treating it for us like it's a reward system and we should be hiding our special interests and telling us our joy is wrong. But really, we could be like, if they just let us be joyful about our special interests, we could spread joy across the planet with the amount of joy that we create. And so I'm excited to be able to give that some focus and to give that part of it some ideas. I know I don't really talk a lot about my special interests. I think people know some of them. Like, I'm pretty well known for liking cats. That's pretty well known about me, I'd say, at this point. I do have a lot of them, and I've always really loved them. And so that's been a lifelong special interest. And then one of my other really longer running ones, and I think the one I don't talk about really at all, in fact, I only talked about it recently, I really like true crime. And I'm really fascinated by true crime. And I think, you know, there's a part of my brain that loves documentaries and all of that stuff. And I think it's because it's real information. It's fact, right? And it's not invented. And I just was always fascinated that the human mind could be so variable that we could have these kinds of criminals out in the world, right? And so somewhere in my like 16-year-old brain, that all made sense. And I just started reading about it like a nonstop. And so that's been something that I've still, you know, it's been sort of, I guess, an almost lifelong interest. And I'm just going to give a shout out to the Morbid, the podcast. Thank you, Alicia, Alana, Ash, and Alana, sorry. The two of them are fantastic. And they do a great podcast where they just run through different true crime stories and all of that. And it's one of my favorite podcasts. And so I thought I would share a little bit of my special interest as we kind of get into our first show.
What's your favorite true crime show? If you had to go, what's the one you go to?
Oh,
You're on an island. You can only bring one. What do you go with?
I really like Forensic Files. I don't know if other people like it. I find his voice very soothing in a Bob Rossi kind of way. And so if I want to fall asleep at night, I will put on Forensic Files to fall asleep. So I definitely do that. I used to watch Unsolved Mysteries when I was a kid. That was a really big one for me. But I watch all that stuff. I do. It's terrible. I met, here's a story. I'll embarrass myself straight out right now. So I'm fairly new to Colorado, fairly new to the town. And Antonio and I, you might have heard if you follow my live stream, we're starting a food truck. So we had done a beta week and the Park County coroner came to our food truck. I was the most starstruck person. I couldn't make whole sentences to the coroner. I couldn't I was just, you have the coolest job. Can I do your job? And it was just really fun. And so that was my most recent embarrassing thing having to do with my special interest because it still happens. But I'm excited to talk to our guest. How about you?
So excited.
Awesome.
Always great.
Right, well, let's introduce everybody to you, Chris. If you don't know Chris, I'm sorry you don't know Chris. You should know Chris. He's a funny, funny dude. And he really does some amazing writing and some amazing projects. And I'm excited to hear about parts of him I don't know about on the internet and all about his special interests. But Chris does have Asperger's syndrome, where he was diagnosed with it. We all know we're all autistic now, and so thank you, world. We can just use one word, that we're all autistic. But that happened for him at 25. I was 36. It happens to us very late. And I loved and want to steal your slightly odd personality part of your bio so badly. I love it. As a fellow slightly odd personality who was also told that most of my life. She's such an odd girl. Such an odd
I was this close to calling autisticnotweird.com slightly odd personality.com.
See, that's
Some
so
days
great.
I wish you did.
Really good. And so I really enjoy everything you do. He does amazing stuff on Autistic Not Weird. You can find great memes, really thoughtful stuff, but it also has a sense of humor to it, which I love because it's a way in to people's brains. And I think it's great. And most recently, you came out with the sequel to your other book, which was Underdogs first. Now you have Underdogs 2 out. So we're going to talk about that too, which amazes me that you can write fiction books. Okay, because I struggle with fiction so much. It's so hard for me to write fiction. And so those autistics that I find that can write fiction, I want like pieces of your brain. So I'm excited to talk to you, and I'm excited to find out what other cool things you have to share with us.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be on, and thank you very much for having me as your first guest.
Excited.
So Chris, I'm going to assume writing is a special interest. And
oh yeah.
And I know you, from what I understand, you started at 13 years old with Sonic the Hedgehog fan fiction.
Yep.
So I must know how I can read some of that.
The thing is, it's the kind of thing which I look back on and I don't want it to feel embarrassing because it did so much to build me up as a writer, but it's like, I get it, my cousin gets it, but it refers to a part of my life which sadly doesn't exist anymore. But then again, I'm so glad that it happened, and it did me so much good as a writer because, well, let's face it, creating your own universe is slightly difficult. But I'm not even talking about that in the literal sense. Creating your own fictional universe is one side of writing. Also, the craft of writing a good story is another one in terms of plot and character and so on. And also actually writing sentence by sentence a good story is difficult as well. What fan fiction allowed me to do was explore these areas and develop my skills as a novice writer with characters who I already knew and a world that I already knew and characters in a world that I already felt really motivated by. Yeah, I was pumping out some stories in just a couple of months back then, whereas it took 10 years between the first draft of Underdogs and the published version, and 9 years between the first draft of Underdogs 2 and the published version. The first draft of Underdogs 3 was written last year, and I wrote on Underdogs 4, the final book, during lockdown, so I am...
Oh, you're ahead of yourself now.
Well, I've kind of had to be because of the sheer enthusiasm that people have approached it with, which is absolutely incredible. And I'd love to go back to the younger me who was writing Sonic fan fiction saying, keep doing what you're doing. People will one day actually read and like your stuff.
Yes.
But it does mean that, I've got to actually do stuff now. I can't do or spent most of the last 10 years doing and think, oh, wouldn't it be right to get Underdogs somewhere and do something valuable with it someday? I've got to actually, as the British people say, put my arse in gear and actually actually go to some efforts.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, Susie. You just said, you talked about how when you were doing the Sonic ones that you would pump out so many, right? And that's that piece of the special interest that we like. The faster we intake the information that we enjoy, the more we want to do output of it, right? And it's like, that's more of that high energy stuff that we were talking about in the beginning. And it happens, it's almost like, I mean, I want to talk about it like it's a biological happening, because it does feel in that way, like the way that when you have true joy, it releases endorphins, and there's all kinds of things that happen that make your body and your brain feel good. And that's what happens, I think, for autistics when we're doing our special interest, is all those good feelings that we don't feel out in the world because we're so overwhelmed by everything, we get to feel when we're doing our special interest, and nothing interrupts it. It's in that hyperfocus bubble, right? And our production value, it's like, it can be really fast, which is why I've always said, I don't understand why people don't use special interest as a way to guide people's careers, right? If you want someone to love their job, start with their special interest.
That's
right?
why I often tell, sorry, go on.
No, please.
That's why I sometimes tell employers, wouldn't you love to have an autistic employee who might not be very good at the interview, but grew up with your product as their special interest?
Yeah, they know it better than you.
Present me a case for not hiring that person.
Right. Exactly. And I think we've done that. We've sort of shamed the special interest. We sort of have kind of, oh, well, don't be the weird kid that obsesses over these things, right? Don't be, you can only talk about this thing and whatever. And yet, if people had encouraged us to kind of chase that a little bit, I think we would have all been a little happier as people, right? Like you were looking back to how you were writing kind of before, like back when you were doing fan fiction, and that always reminds me how there's a certain age, I think, for all of us on the spectrum where we realize our difference. Like we're living our lives, we have no idea we're different, and all of a sudden something happens in our world and we are aware of our difference, and everything changes at that moment. You start hiding things and masking and all of that stuff. And so I'm always trying to get back to that little kid all the time, because I feel like that's where we really live. That's where our authentic selves are, you know?
Yeah, back before we realised that everyone in the world is different to us. It's not us that's different to them. Everyone else is different to us.
Correct. Because that's the experience. That's the reality of our experience.
From our perspective, yeah, it's like right from the beginning of Autistic Not Weird, I used to say, when people say, what's it like being autistic? My answer was, well, to me, it feels completely normal. Am I supposed to feel weird for it? That is literally my experience as my brain depicts it.
Absolutely. I mean, and I tell people all the time, like, I have it 24 hours a day. What are you talking about? I dream with autism. Like there is no way of being for me that doesn't include autism in it, right? I don't have
but don't let
option.
autism
It's not a
define
button
you.
on me. There's no, right. And so, but it's like, but it does define me, and I will let it define me, because it absolutely shifts my perspective on everything that I live with, everything that I do, everything that, even this, like as we're doing this interview, it's coming through the autism filter, and I'm going, I remember what it was like to be little and having my special interest be that amazing thing. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I know you have more questions, Doug. I could talk forever.
No, don't need to apologize. It's refreshing whenever I talk to autistic people who are just so enthusiastic about info splurging about stuff that they love. I mean, why isn't the whole world like that?
I don't know.
Oh yeah, social appropriateness, whoever on earth decided what that was.
Well, I know so many autistic writers, Chris. Why do you think so many autistics are passionate about writing?
Oh, I can tell you one reason that comes immediately to mind. The world is often built without autistic people in mind. And if, let's say you're growing up, let's take the example of a student who I used to work with some years ago in a special school. Autistic teenage girl had written, kind of in the same vein as I'd written loads and loads of Sonic books, she'd written loads and loads of books about a pack of wolves who were who were living in a post-apocalyptic world once all the humans were gone, and she'd written loads of stories about that. It sounded like a really intriguing concept, and that when she told me about it, that's when I suddenly realised that if you're autistic, living in a world where your opinion vaguely matters and the world just goes on with or without your influence. For me, writing Underdogs while I was unemployed, that was absolutely the case for me. While the rest of the world seems to be making your decisions for you and all of that, and it's really depressing. Writing your own books and your own stories gives you the opportunity to control absolutely everything. It means you get to decide what happens. You get to decide what the world looks like. You get to decide what the culture is. You will tell your characters to do things, and they will actually do things. They won't tell you you're wrong for having that kind of opinion. So, yeah, every human has this inbuilt need for some level of control. And I don't mean that in a control freak kind of way or manipulative kind of way. People want some level of autonomy. Like, you want to have at least some level of control over the direction your life is going. And if you don't have that sense of control, and disproportionately, if you're autistic, you're less likely to have that sense of control in a world that's built with everyone else in mind, then writing your own fictional universe, that can completely swallow you up in the best possible way. And it's just it's just so cathartic when you've created your own universe. You know your characters like the back of your hand, and you get to decide what happens to them. You actually have some level of autonomy and control over something in your life that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think about it too, like for me, I get to sort of control the narrative a bit. Am I losing you guys a bit? I'm sorry if I'm losing you guys. I just turned off my video because the internet's kind of wonky right now.
Mine is as well.
Yeah. So I was just kind of thinking about how the other part of writing for me is always kind of having the story go the way I feel like it should have gone in real life. Like, you know, I feel like we run into, as autistics, we run into scenarios in which we are forced to kind of bend around stuff that doesn't make logical sense, right? Or things like that. You know, I have a list, and one day I'm going to write this blog about all the things that neurotypicals do that I do not understand, that I will forever question, right? The other day I just added wearing a mask in your car by yourself because I think that's fascinating. I don't know why you would do that. But there are a lot of things like that for me. And I think a lot of times neurotypicals respond in a social situation in a way that is so confusing to the autistic brain that it's like, well, if I could rewrite that story, here's what you should have said. Why didn't you say this? This was the right thing to say there instead of this mean thing that you did or whatever, you know? And so there's a lot of that piece too. Like, let me rewrite the narrative where I didn't go selectively mute and I actually managed to say to you the things I was thinking. Let me, you know, and all of those things. I've definitely had moments of those when writing. And I think I find that a lot of autistics need that space. We need that space to process through why it felt so uncomfortable to be in a situation, and that writing can help us do that. But I have to ask you, Chris, can I ask a question? I'm going to ask a question. When you tackle a book, right? Because you talked a little bit about it, when you tackled Underdogs, for example, the very first one, you talk about universe creation. When you approach the book, did you create the universe in its entirety and then write the story? Or did you do them simultaneously or separately or what?
It has to be a little bit of both, I think, because one common thing you'll find, particularly among autistic writers, is everything needs to be perfect in that story. And one really difficult thing to come to terms with is the fact that your first draft is never going to be perfect. In fact, your first draft is supposed to not be perfect, because in my experience, the real story comes out in the drafts. So in answer to your question about Underdogs, I created a list of fairly undeveloped characters first and had this scenario that they were in, and then I started plotting point by point the way that the story goes, and it all felt very mechanical and logical because that's just kind of the way I do things. And that worked for the first draft. After the first draft, it needed more than that. It needed the universe around it to be developed more. It needed, well, the writing style needs to be improved. The characters needed more developing. And there are so many different ways that a person can plan. And the only way of guaranteeing it will work is it's got to be something that aligns with your character, like who you are as a writer. George R. R. Martin, Game of Thrones author, he says that there are, in terms of story planning, there are architects and there are gardeners. Architects are the people who plan and plot every single point as if they're designing some kind of building, and then they stick to it. Gardeners are people like him who kind of have an idea and then kind of let the characters do their own thing, so to speak. And while I was writing the Sonic stories, I was about 90% architect, maybe 10% gardener. If it came up with like a funny one-liner while I was in the middle of writing, oh yeah, I'll actually include that. But I'd say these days I'm about 70-30, because I do need to know what I'm doing, but I've learned a couple of things over my years as a writer. First off, you need the flexibility. If you're halfway through a plot line and you realize it's not working, don't be afraid to throw away that plot line and start a new one. But at the same time, is the other thing I learned, don't be a perfectionist while you're writing. It will not work. If you think your first draft is crap, then write it and finish your crap first draft. It doesn't need to be good, it just needs to exist. In fact, the last article I wrote for Autistic Not Weird was, what was it called? 20 tips for aspiring autistic writers from an autistic author. And one of the main points that I put in, and what I tell to my students as well when I'm teaching them creative writing, is, do you know what the first step is towards writing a really good story? Write a terrible story. Ooh. You will not be able to write a good story until you've written plenty of terrible stories. In my case, there's Sonic the Hedgehog fan fiction. Terrible stories, but I have a lot of sentimental value attached to them. The quality of writing is terrible, but I love them so much. And yeah, you've got to make peace with the fact that your first draft is going to suck. It doesn't need to be good, just needs to exist.
Yeah, true. Awesome.
I love that. I think that stops people so often, is worrying about that perfectionism. And I think so often, like, info dump has such like a negative connotation to it, but it seems like with writing it's encouraged.
Sort of. Very, very sort of. There is a right way and a wrong way of info dumping. This is another thing I wrote in the article, another thing which, because of autistic people's huge enthusiasm for, I want you to know everything about this thing that I love.
You have to love it as much as I do.
Absolutely. But what I need to encourage people to do is, if you write, let's say you're writing a fantasy story, and fantasy stories are most common, and sci-fi, the stories which have their own universe, with their own scientific concepts or magic systems or cultures, things like that, things that at some point will need explaining. There's a right way and a wrong way to do all that info dumping. The right way to do it is little bit by little bit throughout the story, so the reader is learning and learning and learning as they go along. The first thing you need to do is give them a reason to care about the character and what the character is going through. The world they live in, you can develop that as you go along. The wrong way to do it is think, okay, before I need to introduce you to this character, here is a vast encyclopedia of everything you need to know about it. Like, novels aren't board games. You don't have to read through the instructions before you learn how to access the story. Give the first priority of chapter 1 is to convince the reader to read chapter 2. The first priority of chapter 2 is to give the reader a reason to read chapter 3. And the best way of doing that is get them to root for the character. You can intrigue them with this really interesting world you built up. If you give them all the details straight away, they'll think, oh, well, don't need to read on anymore. If you give them details which makes them think, oh, I want to know more about this, that will keep them the reading. But yeah, resist the temptation to dump everything into the first chapter. Don't give exposition of the entire world. Give them a character they will love, and then let them explore the world with that character as the novel goes on.
That's amazing advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, so we know that writing's a special interest of yours. Do you have
just a bit.
do you have any others, other special interests?
This Rubik's Cube.
Yes. Have you watched Speedcubers yet?
Oh yes, it's 40 minutes long, and I loved 37 minutes of it.
Oh, what happened in the other 3?
Well, they introduced Max Park, who is an absolutely spectacular, like arguably the best speedcuber in the world, and unfortunately, even though the rest of the documentary was great, it did fall into the very predictable trap of sad piano music with his parents talking about it, saying, when Max was first diagnosed with autism, our world fell apart. And yes, I do understand, obviously, that an autism diagnosis can be quite a shock, and parents can be fearful about what their children can might grow up to be, and so on and so on. But more from a media studies point of view, Felix Zemdegs, the guy who was friends with Max, he was introduced as this child prodigy, Australian, super intelligent, brilliant person. And when Max, who was just as good, if not better than Felix Zemdegs, when he was introduced, it was all about his diagnosis and and all of it. And I felt that he deserved better than that, to be honest.
Yeah, good critique. And that happens to us all the time, right? It's I don't have to lead every conversation with my autism foot. Like, I have other things that I can talk about besides that, like my special interests, for example, that I'd rather talk about.
Give me a second. It's a little bit, well, actually, no, it's not off topic. It's actually completely on topic, but so I'm just, when you're speaking, you're not actually planning a sentence while you're speaking. You're just trying to fill up the silence while you try and find that thing on the internet, which must be here somewhere. Just give me a few seconds. I'm sure I'll find it. Yeah. Here we go. I made a meme for Autistic Not Weird after I watched the Speedcubers, and as soon as my computer actually remembers it is connected to the internet, hello. Come on. Oh, the fan is really blowing on my laptop. It's really, I can hear the cogs work. Here we go. So it's basically text-based, and it says, a guide to representing autism in the media. When an autistic person graduates high school, the news reports should have sad piano music, grainy footage of a small child, and parents saying, when Billy was diagnosed with autism, our whole world fell apart. If an autistic person appears in a talent show, the intro video needs to have sad piano music, grainy footage of a small child, and a parent saying, when Sally was diagnosed with autism, we cried for 3 days straight. When an autistic person breaks the world record for awesomeness, the Netflix documentary needs to have sad piano music, grainy footage of a small child, and a parent saying, when Max was diagnosed with autism, it felt like our lives were over. And when an autistic person flies into space, blows up a comet, and saves the world, the news reports needs to have sad piano music, grainy footage of a small child, and a parent saying, when Samuel's diagnosed with autism, we felt like giving up on everything. Remember, I say sarcastically, the more tragic you make someone look, the more it looks like they've overcome their autism. And dignity isn't as important as looking inspirational anyway.
Oh, brilliant. See? Brilliant. Brilliant and funny.
It felt really cathartic reading that.
Good. It should, right? It's like speaking our truths is always kind of like, hey, it feels good to say that out loud.
Oh, yeah.
So, Chris, how is, so you have your second book of Underdogs out now, Tooth and Nail. How's that going?
This has been a fairly good week for it, really. It's a pleasant coincidence that we had this recording right now, a couple of days after it got reviewed in a national newspaper.
Saw that. Congratulations.
Thank you. And they actually
did it blow your mind?
Yeah, the thing is, I assumed that they wouldn't like it because it's shamelessly a non-mainstream book. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, the general feeling I get from readers is that it's great for autistic teenagers, it's great for autistic adults, it's great for non-autistic teenagers and adults as well. You don't really need to know much about neurodiversity in order to appreciate the characters and root for them in everything they go through. But even with that, I still feared that a book reviewer who reads hundreds of books per year would write in a national newspaper how awful it was and so on, because professional book reviewers need to have professional integrity and need to be honest about if they think a book is crap. I was delighted when this person just openly said, yeah, this book isn't really for me, but it's a very important book for the neurodiverse population, and I love what Chris is doing. And wow, thank you.
Right? It was really nice article, and congratulations, really. And I think the community, I mean, I've been sharing your books all over, but I know the community has given you an awesome response, which has to feel great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been an interesting week. It's no wonder I'm so tired.
So you think it was good timing, but what happens is when you come on the info dump files, great things happen to anyone that comes on. It's just the way it works.
That's right.
Can I appear on your podcast most weeks, please?
That's right.
How can people get your book?
It's on Amazon. Underdogs is the first book. Underdogs, Tooth and Nail is the second book. And Bonnello was spelled Bonnello. That's my last name, just in case people hadn't gathered. It's also available on the publisher's website, unbound.com. It's on Waterstones, it's on Barnes & Noble, and a bunch of other places as well. The first book has an audiobook as well, which I was delighted about, given that lots of people were asking about it, because obviously accessibility is quite a big thing in the autism and disability communities. And I was told not to expect an audiobook, not to feel too optimistic about it by the publishing company, because they're surprisingly expensive to make. They only really get made for the ones which production companies really believe that, well, they might get the money back. So I was told not to expect one. But a few weeks before publication, I got an email from the UK's largest producer of audiobooks asking if we still have the rights. So, yeah, these last 2 years have been completely and utterly surreal, but awesome. That was a long answer to where can you get the books, but yeah, I could just say Amazon. I
can't imagine.
But I'm also info dumping about my special interest.
Now, Becca and I are big fans of Inside the Actors Studio. I don't know if you've watched much of Inside the Actors Studio.
I haven't.
Yeah. And one thing at the end of the show is the host, James Lipton, he did a survey. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to kind of take our spin on that, and we created kind of our own survey called Our Autistic Studio. So we're going to go through the questions with you. We're going to do this with all of our guests that come on the show. So the first one is, what are your pronouns?
He and him.
And what's your preferred stim?
The middle finger and ring finger on both hands, flicking together like this. Hands by my side while I'm walking, because it really, really helps me to think.
Mm. What's your favorite curse word?
Are you sure you want me to swear?
Yes.
Bollocks.
Yes.
It is such a funny word. It's so British. And funny enough, legally, it doesn't actually count as a swear word. It means testicles, just in case you don't know what it means. But apparently, it's an old Anglo-Saxon word. So, and there's
great.
something.
And when you say it with an accent, it sounds so much better than if I try and say it.
Yeah, try saying it now. I'm curious.
Bollocks. I can't even say it.
You try to say it with a British accent. Say it with your accent.
Bollocks.
Yeah, I was expecting like Ballocks, because, well,
Ballocks. I'm from New York, so I do the other side.
But yeah, it gets out all the frustration that you want to get out in a curse word, but at the same time, it just sounds really funny. Like, seriously, try saying it and not laughing. I also invent my own curse words, so I won't go into many details because I know that young people listen to stuff as well. But the most recent one I made up was piss burgers, like creative stuff like that.
The next question is, what?
I love the fact of how much I concentrate specifically on that question when I answered the first one with 2 words, and then the second one with a paragraph. And
some questions are going to elicit more of a response. So the next question is, Who do you love and what are you doing about it?
Oh, wow. Wow. Who do I love
I
and
know
what am
he
I doing
got
about
deep.
it? Okay. I have an answer, but it's difficult to answer without making me sound like some kind of magnanimous philanthropist and so on. So I'm just going to say what's on my mind. I love autistic people, so I'm advocating for their rights, their dignity, and for their right to access the world on their terms in a way that brings them joy.
Love that.
I love my family, so I'm trying not to be too irritating to them. I love my friends and my godchildren, and just try and be there for them. Love the people work with at school, and trying to help them, staff and students, actually to be the best that they can be, and so on. Yeah, most of the love I feel is very much love in the general sense, and yeah, I thought I'd have a more fluent answer to that, but I really wasn't prepared.
You may be neurotypical if
you spend your working days dropping hints and partaking in backstabby office politics. And I know it sounds like stereotyping, and I'm really sorry, but we've been on the receiving end of it for so long.
Thank you.
fair point, fair point. You may be autistic if
You can go into great enthusiastic details about what other people think is the smallest thing.
what's something you want to learn to do or be better at?
Oh wow. Learn to do, possibly playing piano. I've never managed to even begin to play the piano. What to get better at, one of my life goals is to solve a 3x3x3 Rubik's Cube in less than 10 seconds.
Nice.
My current record is 17.6 seconds. Of course, when you get down to the stage where there aren't actually that many seconds left to chop off, it gets exponentially more difficult.
What autistic social media account should people be paying attention to?
Is it cheating to say Autistic Not Weird?
Nope.
It is not at all.
Okay, Autistic Not Weird and Underdogs Facebook page.
What is the one thing in your routine you couldn't possibly live without?
Biologically, that would be sleep.
All right.
I'll say sleeping on my own terms. What that means is, you know, one thing I don't like is the fact that it's considered sensible if you go to bed really early and get up really early, but it's considered lazy if you go to bed late and you get up late. If you're having 8 hours of sleep either way, it's really just a social construct based on. One of the great things about being self-employed, that this doesn't apply on teaching days, of course, because schools do have fixed hours, but when it's working from home days and working on Autistic Not Weird days, I get to change my working hours to match my waking hours. A lot of people do a 9 to 5. I do a 10 till 6. I start working at 10 and I finish work at 6.
High five. I do 10 to 4. Yeah.
Dog, cat, or must I choose?
There's been a dog next door that's been whining and yapping because they shut it outside for all day, and so I've had to close the windows and doors and get really hot in this room. So for some reason, I might just go with cat. I mean, a bit about dogs. I have a lot of respect for dogs. I know that they do amazing things and they're very loyal and so on. They seem to have no understanding of my comfort zones, though. Especially the small trip hazard type dogs.
Yeah.
As the saying goes, all cats have Asperger's. But yeah, there are a couple of traits in cats. I'm not saying that cats are literally autistic. I'm saying that I think it's easier to socialize on my terms with a cat than it is to socialize with a dog.
Yes, I agree.
And our last question, what does autistic joy mean to you?
You know, the sheer enthusiasm with barely any space to breathe within the sentences that you spent the last half an hour listening to. It's basically that, except a little bit more than that. It's the Autistic joy means the ability to enjoy stuff that you know is fun without caring whether everyone else thinks it's fun. It's me loving Rubik's Cubes, not because society thinks there's some kind of sign of amazing intelligence, which they're not, by the way. You don't need to be intelligent to solve a Rubik's Cube. You just need to have half decent memory and half decent pattern recognition. That's it. You're not a genius if you can solve a cube. But even if people saw it as something really negatively nerdy, or if people saw it as something positively brilliant, it's just enjoying this regardless of whatever the hell people. And yeah, what I said about writing as well. Autistic joy meant writing Sonic fan fiction and ultimately writing Underdogs without caring who thought what about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I did care what my cousin thought about it because I was writing the stories for him. And once I was publishing Underdogs, I did care about what the eventual audience might think. But the first draft, written in 2010 as a coping mechanism for unemployment, I didn't care what other people thought. It wasn't for them. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's why it turned out so well. I wasn't writing under the influence of other people's judgments. I was writing what I wanted to write. Mm-hmm. There's some authenticity there. And that's a nice word to finish the question on. What autistic joy for me means authenticity in its purest form.
Yes, I agree. Nice answer.
Yeah. Thank you. I literally came with it on the spot, and I'm not normally good at improvising sentences. All of my sentences are normally planned very carefully over the course of 10 years before being written down. Or put into print.
I wish I was such a good editor of myself. I am not.
Well, Chris,
that was tiring, but it was so good.
Chris, thanks for joining us today and being our first guest. I know me and Becca love so much of what you do. So just keep up the awesome work.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks very much for having me.
I'm so excited to have had you as our first guest. I haven't stopped smiling this entire time. My cheeks hurt.
I've noticed.
It's not my fault. It's because we're talking about special interests and sharing joy, and so my mouth hurts. I don't always smile this much. Usually I get the resting bitch face comments. So
I've just realized at this moment that these muscles here...
Right, they're not used to it. They don't do this often. And so I'm glad to have sore cheeks from smiling. I'm excited to have been able to spend some time with both of you guys, smiling and talking about good, positive things and putting that out into the world. So I'm excited. I say good first episode. I say I would tune in again.
It has been rather awesome.
Fantastic. Well,